Welcome to the Better Together podcast, where we look at ways that we can come together to work together to help each other grow and effectively serve the Lord. I have here again today attorney David Gibbs III. He's the president and general counsel of the National Center for Life and Liberty. We're so glad that you're here with us again today, Attorney Gibbs, and I wanted to ask you a bit about child protection. So important for people bringing their children to church to feel like they're at a safe place, and so important for churches to safeguard the children. What are some things that need to be involved in policies and procedures to more effectively protect our children?
Well, I always start in this topic with a very simple statement, Dr. Moody. Times have changed. Okay. And until you get that understanding, anything else we talk about is going to seem unnecessary. I grew up in a world where, it was okay to spank other people's children. Okay. Now, if your pastor came up to you today and said, I'm going to put you in charge of the child beating ministry, you would be unwise to take that position. And you need to recognize your pastor doesn't like you very much.
Yes.
Okay, that's not going to go well, because we now know today that if you were to, physically strike someone else's child, there could well be criminal charges, civil charges. It would be an unwise practice. And we, in the 70s, there was child protection. It was real simple: boys with boys and girls with girls. I mean, you just put a man, he could be overnight, he could be in a tent, it could be in a class, it could be a music lesson, man with boys, lady with gals. That was viewed as child protection, and it worked in that time period. Now today we have, the whole sexual minority, the LGBTQ, the other approach to things, and statistically the insurance carriers are saying right now about 50% of the allegations are same-sex in the church world. So not to put anyone in fear, but if you're a pastor, if you're a ministry leader, you're as vulnerable if you're a man with a little boy as you are with a little girl. And so that's a big change.
Yeah.
And I think people need to recognize that, it's a different universe. Okay. We're living in a world now where, not what used to be the presumption. Now it's a different day. I think the second thing people need to realize is nothing wrong needs to happen at your church for an allegation to be made. Now, I know a lot of my Free Will Baptist Church friends that say, we're a reasonably small church, Mr. Gibbs. We're all interrelated. We all love each other. I know these teachers. I know these folks, and nobody at our church is ever going to do anything. And, you're probably right. Statistically, most people who volunteer in a church are very safe. They're very appropriate to be there. But what we need to let them understand is we're not questioning them. We are here today saying that one allegation, and by the way, a false allegation, could send an innocent person into a lot of difficulty, including even potentially criminal charges. And so when you come with this approach of child protection, child safety, it can't be we're somehow questioning the good people that are serving in our church, but we really have kind of three goals, and they're all important, but the one is the most important. The first goal is we want to keep the church out of court. I mean, that's just good stewardship. We don't want to have unnecessary liability. Number two, we want to keep our workers out of trouble. So that's good stewardship, volunteers. But then number three, and this is paramount, and you've already touched on it, we want the children to be safe. If a child is safe anywhere, I believe they should be safe at church. And so making sure that we have policies where parents and others can be sure that if they bring their children to a Free Will Baptist church, they will be safe. Now, we're not here to pick on any other group, but we can talk about it. I mean, I say Catholic Church in modern America, a lot of people, their first thought is scandal, abuse, cover-up. We've seen in the last few years major media exposés, Independent Baptists, a lot of scandal, a lot of issues, Southern Baptists dealing with issues, resolutions. So I think we would be naive to think that, we are immune from the accusation, and then also to recognize that, most people lump everybody together anyway. I mean, all of a sudden we become another religious organization. We become another church, and we say, well, no, we're different. Well, we are, but to the average person, they want to know, if I put my child at your church, will they be safe? And so I'm encouraging pastors, again, we know culturally this is a problem. So let's confront it head on. Let's let people know we are absolutely committed to child protection, child safety. We believe in it. We're going to stand for it. We're going to fight for it. And that then requires a few things. Okay, first of all, If you look at child protection, child safety, there's really three main parts to it. Okay. Part number one is, who do you let work with the kids? Okay.
Yeah.
That's, kind of what I call the selection criteria. Some people talk about screening, but you have to accept the fact that whoever you let work with the children, you have some responsibility for their selection. Okay. So that's kind of the who. Then number two, you have some responsibility for how you supervise them. So, the old days of, we just got a bunch of kids, we got a bunch of workers, we just hope for the best. Well, that is leaving you very vulnerable. There have to be some written policies that you as a church spell out. And again, smaller churches, it can be one page. Bigger churches may have a book. I mean, don't feel any pressure. But you need to have some policies that spell out what you expect of your workers. So let me give you just a couple that are like easy ones. Number one, we don't abuse kids. So just spell it out,
Yeah.
Now, that one, again, people go, well, I thought that's kind of obvious. Well, you will find that if anybody is a little odd, and I've actually had some pastors say, we had some people that I thought were a little unusual, and they wanted to volunteer. And I wasn't real comfortable, but I showed them a copy of our rules and they said, like, you guys really don't mess around. And you know what? They disappeared.
Yeah.
And so they were coming in maybe with ill intentions. And so it lets them know clearly where you stand, but then also gives parents confidence. Okay, these people believe that this is absolutely paramount that these children be kept safe. And then number two, I'm a big fan of the 2-worker rule. Now, the 2-worker rule is a simple rule, but it has a lot of benefits. Okay, number one, it protects workers from false accusations. So you're in a room and a little boy says, you punched me, you hurt me, you did something. Well, I'd sure like to have another adult right there to say, no, I didn't.
Right.
And you're protecting your workers. But then the bad actors, those that want to hurt kids, one of the things they try to do is isolate them. Because that is kind of the profile. You're not going to abuse a child in front of a group. You're going to get them away, get them alone, build trust, the grooming, and then you take advantage and abuse. Well, if we have we don't allow you to be alone, that really does eliminate that risk. So it works to keep children safer. Now, a trendy area that I'm encouraging churches to think about is electronic communication. Okay, most predators are right now working the texting, social media, all the different ways. The apps change daily.
Right.
So we won't even try to say which technology, but they want to get in the heart and minds of the kids. And I've had pastors say to me, well, David, that's the parents' responsibility. Yeah, they're probably right, but they don't do it.
Right.
Well, those kids shouldn't have phones. Probably right, but they do. Well, why are they communicating at 11 midnight? Well, they probably shouldn't be, but they are. And so we have to live in the world where, we have to assume that our people need to hear from us clearly that we do not want you communicating electronically with other people's children. Now, we're not trying to get into people's family or relatives, but I'm talking where a teacher or worker is communicating with the children. And somebody says, well, but they want to be friendly or they want to be helpful. Well, I would encourage that be done in group. You can send it out to a group of kids or copied with another person, include their spouse or include somebody else on the text and you can still communicate. But the public schools are moving strongly in this direction. I was with a ISD, independent school district in Texas, and one of the teachers is actually a piano player in a Free Will Baptist church. He'd been there like 25 years. He came up to me and he said, David, let me tell you how we got trained this year at our public school. And he was a 20-year teacher.
Yeah.
He said, you text one student, you're fired, no questions asked. We don't even want to know what the text was. We're just done with these teachers having affairs or getting in situations with kids that they shouldn't be in. So, they have a message board where they can leave homework assignments. Parents can log in. They are allowed to text an adult, like a parent, if a situation comes up. But they said, we have zero tolerance for texting a student. Now, I'm not saying every church has to go to that level, but I do want you to at least be thinking, this is how the predators are able to groom, develop relationship. You say, my sweet little 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old lady children in our church would not do anything. These little girls are innocent. But if you allow a 30-year-old man to be texting into their heart and mind, bad things can happen. And I get those phone calls. So as a church saying, okay, we're committed to having rules, training on them, making sure people know. And that 2-worker rule is one that you really want to think through and strongly encourage. And I mean, that's van rides, that's classrooms, that's just thinking through that process. The third,
before you move on from that, so really a bottom line is be careful about isolation, and then anything that's part of the problem with the text, anything that is really private, if a church is going to have that, like a youth pastor, then the whole youth group is getting the text, not just one person.
I strongly recommend that. I mean, if you text out, meet me for pizza at the church at 7.
Everybody
love you. Okay. Now, you send that to one kid, I'm telling you right now, that love you can get distorted, twisted, and if you're ever on trial, if that went to 27 kids, not my style, but you're fine.
Right.
And then I had one youth pastor, I mean, he was 29 years old, and he starts counseling this 13-year-old girl. And again, this is a salt of the earth family. Dad's on the board. Mom directs the nursery. They're both lay people. She's at every event. And, she has a breakup, which, I mean, at age 13, that's just teenage drama. But, her boyfriend has dumped her or whatever. And this guy, 29 years old, well, he's an idiot. Yeah, I think he's an idiot. He said I'm dumb. Well, I think you're brilliant. He says I'm ugly. Well, I think matter of fact, you're the most beautiful girl I've ever met. Well, and you see where a 29-year-old, now, again, somebody may say, well, he's just trying to be encouraging. But what the experts would say is he's grooming her. He's developing a special relationship, and he's beginning to see if this girl will respond. And these predators are very, very dangerous people. Well, in this particular case, one night he texts her and says, I want ice cream. And the little girl's like, I'm in bed. Well, you going to get ice cream? Yeah, you want to get ice cream? Well, I can't ask my parents. Well, don't ask your parents. They're going to say no. And he drove past the front of her house, and she paddled out the window. And, and the first night, all they did was get ice cream.
Right. But then later.
And by the way, predators are very savvy because they want to make sure that, number one, the child will keep their mouth shut. And then they always have a story. And if you got somebody in your church that's always got a story, but she was running away, I had to rescue her. I took her for ice cream and took her home. They'll have a story. Never quite makes sense, but they'll have a story. And then, as you can imagine, he continued to very sexually abuse this girl for years. And it actually got caught a few years later. The girl was acting rebellious. Sin will show up towards her mother. And the father snatched the cell phone and found a few messages from this guy that had not been erased. Now, let's just put on the table, this is a nice pastor. He was in the state of North Carolina, good man, running about 400 people in his church. Okay, this youth pastor's 29 years old. He finds out about this, calls the police. Youth pastor goes to jail forever. That's the right result there. But now you got this heartbroken family.
Right.
You got this girl who, by the way, is in love with this guy because, his wife's going to die. There's always a story.
Right.
And she's going to marry him. And, they took away her boyfriend. And she's now going through the whole youth group now that it's out, that telling them how great sex is. And she's wearing black. And she's not sure there's a God. Okay. And it's very sad.
Right.
They're trying to minister to all of this. The family has decided not to sue, which is interesting that a lot of families wouldn't make that decision. But the girl isn't 18 yet. So at some point, she gets to decide. And so this pastor is sitting there with all of this heartbreak, emotion, humiliation. Your youth pastor's in prison. And he says, is there something I could have done? And I said, I don't know if it would have worked, but if you'd had the no texting rule,
it would have sure.
It would have at least told that little girl, well, we're not supposed to do this. Now, again, and he would have been violating your policy. The parents might have known. And by the way, I'm diverting here, and I know you're an expert on parenting and helping parents, but I do encourage parents, check the phones and also check the bills. If you see a whole ton of numbers for your kids texting or communicating that you don't recognize, always a good question to find out who that is.
Yes.
And it may be a friend at school. I'm not saying it's always nefarious, but I'm just saying part of parenting in today's world, if you're going to give them these very powerful tools we call smartphones, I say they're smarter than most of the people. They do a lot. But, be checking and even figuring out, some of these kids will be looking at things that would be pornographic or communicating with people, and just make sure that you have a little thumb on what they're looking at. But if there'd been that policy at this church, the hope might be that this young girl's life, and I believe God can restore and help, but when you look at victimization, and from your background, those are very long, hard battles, and really it's kind of like trauma. It's almost like a sexual trauma to underage minors from adults is something that people can learn to cope with, but it is very devastating and very hurtful, and it does create a lot of animosity, and that's partly why some of these people turn on church and God, because they almost feel like their abuse was within the religious system. And so as pastors and ministry leaders, this is something that's very serious and has tremendous consequences, and so very important to think about those rules and procedures.
Excellent. Now you were thinking about some other things as far as any other key elements when we think about child protection. You mentioned we watched driving. We're really careful about isolation. Anything else we need to think of as we're trying to make sure our kids are safe at church?
Well, I kind of walk through the three. We have the selection of who's going to be there. We need to make sure we have some background checks, some screening, some assessing even temperament. Just because someone doesn't have a background doesn't mean they should be teaching kids. Then we've been talking about the rules and procedures and different things. And then a third area that I think is very important, and this has been a problem in some church groups, certainly some of the Baptist groups, some of the Catholic groups, is the cover-up. What do we do when there's an allegation?
Yes.
And people can look at all different laws in all different states. Some states ministers are mandatory reporters. Some states they're voluntary reporters. But I've encouraged church leaders, and I'm talking anybody that's teaching, volunteering on staff, whether you have a school or not. If you have a school or preschool, you are always a mandatory reporter. But to just view yourself as a mandatory reporter. Just let everybody know, whether you're in counseling or anywhere else, that if we reasonably suspect that there's been child abuse, we're going to report it to the authorities. Now, let me walk through those two parts. Number one, reasonably suspect. Okay, it's the totality of circumstances. Don't get paranoid. Don't look for abuse behind every bush. I mean, there's a lot of great people, and we're not going to just be falsely accusing. That would be nonsensical. But, a boy walks in, says, my daddy whooped me last night, call the cops. You know the daddy, you know the family, you know this kid. You may not suspect anything. You might say, son, keep talking like that. We're going to go get your daddy. He might have to do it again. Completely appropriate. Okay. Little girl walks up. She's got bruises on her neck. She acts strange. She's in a single-parent home. The mother's had some odd men in and out of the house. And you ask her about the bruises, and she gets evasive. She won't answer questions. You say, hey, let me talk with your mom. No. Whatever you do, don't talk to my mom. Now, the one case, the kid was asking you to call the cops, but you didn't suspect. In this case, the girl's saying, don't do anything. You might suspect.
Yeah.
And so what I encourage is, if you reasonably suspect, to report it to law enforcement. Now, there are social service hotlines and others. I'm a fan of law enforcement. They tend to be a little more measured. The calls are generally answered by people that are a little more sophisticated. You're not calling a hotline. You can certainly call the hotline, but I generally, if you have a relationship, I encourage pastors to think about, if you're going to report a suspicion of child abuse, who should you call? And before you have the issue, figure it out. Call your sheriff, call your police department. You may, in a bigger town, they're going to say, we have a special victims unit. You need to call this number, and then you might have a more rural sheriff says, you call me, I'll handle it, preacher.
Right.
Great, you got it. Okay, but maybe have a little protocol in place that you think about. If we do reasonably suspect, we're going to report. Pastors, if it does come up, this is not something you pray about, think about, spend a lot of time. This is a quick report. Most predators can eliminate evidence. You say, well, I want to go confront the guy. Okay, let me warn you. First of all, that is not Matthew 18. That is incredibly unwise, because it's not your ought that you have with this individual. You're trying to protect a child, and you could tip off where that child's life could be in jeopardy. Evidence could be destroyed. So just recognize that you need to basically report to the authorities and keep your mouth shut. One other little point I do bring up, document the fact that you did report. Some states do ask you to put it in writing, some don't. But the bottom line is, 20 years from now, when this child is now a young adult and they go online and say, preacher so-and-so knew about this and didn't do anything. It's always handy to be able to say, well, no, actually, I did do something. I went to the authorities. And that will protect, again, the optics of your good name, but also, most importantly, give the authorities the opportunity to do something. And then let me just add, don't wait around and hope the police do great things or do nothing, because you never know. I've had situations where I thought, man, there's going to be arrests tomorrow, and nothing happened. I've also had situations where I'm like, I don't think this is too much. And boy, it's amazing. Just depends on where you're at, what happens, what other things are in their files. So I just encourage the police or the pastors that deal with the police to just not have an expectation one way or the other. But your mindset is, if we suspect, we report, and then we cooperate. So
Excellent.
If the police say we need to come talk to you, we cooperate, and to have that spirit. Now, there are some people, and this is maybe more old thinking, that say, well, if the abuser says he's sorry and if everybody's willing to just kind of forgive and go on. Well, here's just a few warnings, okay? And this is now having watched this over 25 years, okay? You certainly can make that case, and trust me, the abusers who are good manipulators are going to make that case.
Right.
My wife, my kids, my family. But the recidivism, which is the repeat rate, is sky high.
Yeah.
And very rarely will these people stop. I mean, there is going to be some doctors, and again, I'm not an expert, but some doctors have said it's akin to like heroin. It's a very strong addiction when people have crossed the line to act inappropriate with children, that it is almost impossible for them to stop. Now, we believe in God and the power of the Holy Spirit, but the point is thinking that you're not putting other children at risk. Your goal is not just to punish this individual while they may deserve it. The goal is to protect other innocent children. And he says, well, I won't hurt any other kids in the house, or I won't hurt the other grandkids, or I won't do this. And boy, I will just say that I have watched where a number of pastors have had their lives and ministries destroyed by trying to over-rehabilitate a sex offender who was manipulating them. And then you say, well, I'm not sure. I mean, the guy and the victim. In today's world, you need to be a victim-centric church. So if there's a little girl that says this man did something, doesn't mean you have to go put the guy in jail, but you let the authorities sort it out. But then you need to be a church that says, we want to make sure if a child's safe anywhere. And even accusations that fly that you can't totally know ultimately what happened, letting people know that we want you to have confidence that if you put a child in our church, whether it's VBS, whether it's through any transportation, school, other ministry, that to the best of our ability, we are going to work to keep them safe.
Oh, that's excellent. You're spot on. In my early days, I worked as a psychologist in a correctional facility and worked with sex offenders, and they were all sorry. They would all never do it again. And you would even hear, people say things like that. Well, if someone's repented, they repented. And one of the things I used to say to pastors is, if someone's really repented, they'll do whatever is necessary to make things right. And, like Saul said he was sorry, but he really didn't repent.
That's right.
So there's examples of that in the Scripture. And I even worked with a fellow that was a sex offender but had not been convicted of it in the prison. And I think he really repented, and he said, I don't ever want to do this again. And so he actually chose to be transferred to our sex offender treatment unit, which was a difficult situation in a prison setting. But I think he really repented. He really did not want to do that, and the result of that was he admitted to doing something that no one did not know he had done, and did what he needed to do, he thought, to get better, because he didn't want to hurt anybody like that again. So what you've said there is really spot on.
And let me drift into a topic that needs to be addressed for the pastors. Should you let a registered sex offender
okay, good,
attend your church?
Yes.
Because I get this call pretty regularly, because it's a tricky situation. And I say to the pastors and ministry leaders, the answer is it depends. Okay. First of all, legally, you can ban anybody that you deem to be a safety risk. So if someone is just out of prison for molesting underage children, you think they're a risk, you can tell them no. Okay. And sometimes you have to look at probation, parole, other documents. They may not even be allowed to come to church. Okay. So you can always say no. Some churches say, well, no, we'd rather have them come. Okay, and this tends to be the bigger churches. Now, we're not going to let them in our children's way. We're not going to, but, and this might even be the mega churches. We've got thousands of people coming in and out. There's just nothing we can do. But, some churches have been bit by that.
Yeah.
Not that he's Free Will Baptist, but Hybels Church used to let them come in Chicago, and now they ban them. So, I mean, we've watched even where some of the mega churches got concerned about safety. Most Free Will Baptists are going to do what I call the middle position. I call it the babysit the molester. We have rules, okay?
Yeah.
And I agree with you, Dr. Moody. They have to sign and fully cooperate.
Yeah.
Okay, first of all, I'm going to arrive late.
Yeah.
I'll leave early. I'll sit here. I won't use the bathroom. I'll never be in the children's wing. I won't talk to any minors on campus. I just want to hear you preach, preacher. And some churches have had that successful, but I have found that lots of those molesters have come into church because grandma wants them to come. They don't really want to be there. And then they like, I got to use the bathroom. And then you find them milling around the children's wing. And you as a pastor have to say, you know what? You're not here for the right reasons. We laid out what we agreed to. And sometimes you need to put that in writing, actually have them sign it. But just letting pastors know, you don't have to let them come. It's a privilege, not a right. And then also recognizing that not all molesters are the same. So I had a pastor in Colorado that failed to report child abuse. And he was a mandatory reporter. He's a registered sex offender. Generally nice guy, but he's on the list and he didn't report it. Okay, if he wanted to come to your church, it might be a little different than the guy that just served 10 years for raping underage children. So you don't have to treat them all the same, but I do encourage you to think about it. And when in doubt, you have to put the safety of the children above them attending. Now, can you minister to them at Starbucks? Can you send them, I guess I say CDs, but that may even be dating us. So send them electronic, let them watch your messages online. They can download the podcast, but they can do different things. But just make sure that as a church that you're doing it by decision, not by default. Because if they're coming in and somebody says, hey, that's a registered sex offender, you as a church leader want to take proactive steps to make sure that you keep your children safe.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing with us.
That's a delight.
Again, my friend, and thank you for the good work you're out there doing. And we'll just keep working and let's all do what we can to keep our kids safe.
Yes, sir.